And thank you again for being here for the Social Impact Conference brought to you by CETSI and ACBN. My name is Ryan Knight, one of the co-founders of the Afro-Caribbean Business Network, ACBN, and one of the directors and I guess co-founders of CETSI, the social economy through social inclusion. And it's always a pleasure to bring these conversations to you because we get to really dig deeper into the work that's happening all around us. And we have Hazel with us, but just before we introduce our esteemed guest, as always, we begin all things by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So if you're here to learn more about the future of worker co-ops in Canada, you are in the right place. We have Hazel Corcoran, the Executive Director of the Canadian Worker Co-operative Federation. And we'd love to begin by Hazel, if you can give us a brief introduction of yourself and for our listeners, a bit of an overview of your remarkable work.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Hazel Corcoran, Executive Director, longstanding of the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation, and have been involved in a variety of other parts of the cooperative movement in Canada as well. And our organization really exists to help develop new worker cooperatives, support the existing ones, network with the rest of the co-op sector, do advocacy. We have a whole variety of services. I could pop the website into the chat there later. But so among the things that we focus on are advocacy work. A big thing we've been involved in of late is as the exciting employee ownership trust space is taking off and they've got the various provisions in place, we have kind of partnered and ridden their coattails, I guess, to say that the same sorts of benefits should be there for worker co-ops, and that's been going reasonably well, although it's paused with Parliament being prorogued, which is very frustrating. But we think that that's in place, and a variety of other things we've advocated for are still underway. We have a technical assistance program whereby folks can apply for small grants to hire consultants to help them to start or further enhance their worker co-ops. We have an academy incubator. We have a small investment fund that we're seeking to grow through our advocacy and interactions with Social Finance Fund and other things. A monthly e-newsletter, lots of 101 webinars around governance, finance, and other things in worker co-ops that are all free. An annual conference, regional meet and greets, group insurance programs, a common good capital program whereby we enable co-ops of all types, not only worker co-ops, to invest, to have shares and community bonds put into RSPs or TFSAs. We have a big focus on justice, equity, diversity, decolonization, and inclusion through our so-called JEDDI committee and a racial justice action plan, including grants and some equity advisors that we used to call BIPOC advisors. And we're going to be doing research in conjunction with Transform Practice Co-op on specific challenges faced by equity denied groups who are running worker co-ops. I think that's mostly all I'd like to say about what we're doing.
Well, I'd also love you to dig a bit deeper into the context of co-op, because even people might hear the word co-op and there's different kind of segments of it. And so worker co-op, can you give us a bit of background on specifically what that does for a company or for an entity?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, good point. Yeah, so I mean, cooperatives are generally speaking enterprises that are only controlled by their members for their benefits and that follow the statement of cooperative identity, including the values and the 7 co-op principles, a key underpinning of which is that it's democratic, one member, one vote, and not one share, one vote, open membership, cooperation among cooperatives, concern for community and environment. And specifically what's different. So, I mean, the major types of cooperatives, especially in Canada, are consumer focused, like housing co-ops, most food co-ops, and credit unions, which are financial co-ops that are consumer owned, and then farmer owned co-ops, Agri-Foods, Gailey in Ontario, Solio in Quebec, etc., and then worker co-ops, which are the ones which have the employees or contractors, which are the members. Um, so the worker co-op movement is very fast growing, but it's quite small compared to the rest of the co-op movement. So people tend to be more familiar with the other types. The fourth kind I would mention are multi-stakeholder co-ops, which have a variety of different kinds of stakeholders, and can be consumers, producers, workers, other support organizations. And our organization encompasses not only worker co-ops, but multi-stakeholder co-ops where there's substantial worker control.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot in common with employee ownership generally, but I guess the focus is not only that it be employee owned, but that also it be very democratically run.
Right, because if employee owned could still be the shares are not equal, like one person, one vote. They might have multiple shares per person.
Right.
They would have multiple votes. But I know this work is, I would say, it's not difficult, but it's a lot to do. So I'm curious what keeps you going and what you enjoy most about, or what's rewarding for you by operating CWCF.
Hmm. Good question. I mean, in a way, it's difficult to do, but mostly because we haven't been socialized to cooperate. We've been socialized to compete in this society, right? So most societies these days, but I think once you learn the principles of it and have, spent time working with cooperatives and so on, it's just such a wonderful way to work because you're prioritizing people instead of profit. And um, it's very inspiring to get engaged with the people who are doing this work on the ground. It's just like the most wonderful group of folk, and everyone's about mutual aid for each other within their co-ops and across their co-ops. So, um, yeah, it's a great space to be in. The biggest challenge is the lack of knowledge out there, and I think it might be getting a bit easier with technology that we have these days and such. But yeah, we just keep plugging away because it's an inspiring crowd and inspiring way to be.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that when messages you want to get those out there, like the big companies can pump millions, billions of dollars into the narrative. And so the worker co-ops, like you said, when you get into it and understand it, it's such a remarkable way to see a company run, but we don't have the billions of dollars to pump into the awareness campaign to say, like, hey, did you even know about this? So you mentioned a couple of the challenges of like not being known. Are there any other key challenges that you see with developing a co-op or especially a worker-owned co-op?
Yeah, they are. Before we go into more challenges, I just want to say, yeah, you're right that we don't have the billions that, capitalist enterprise might have. But what we do have going, which is interesting, is the United Nations has declared 2025 as the International Year of Cooperatives for the second time. And, I was one of the few Canadians lucky enough to be at the launch conference for this in New Delhi in November. And it was really, really inspiring to hear from the UN folks and the International Co-op Alliance folks who were there, really focusing on, um, you know, we are clear what all the challenges are in the world today, right? I mean, there's increasing polarization and, lack like inequality and climate change challenges and so on. But cooperatives are really such a great way to address them. And to hear, I think, especially from the UN and how inspired they are and how committed they are to seeing the cooperative movement help to solve these problems on a global level, that's a
That,
thing we've got going, right? And everything that comes out of that is available to us to try to get the message out. So we're really going to be focusing on that this year. So,
yeah, that's
which,
really good
yeah,
to know.
right. Yeah. So anyway, in terms of other challenges, I guess the fact that so many professionals, that people wanting to start a business or convert a business to worker ownership, the fact so many professionals, lawyers, accountants, et cetera, do not understand this structure means that
Right.
people have to kind of end up explaining, like justifying why they want to take this path. Um, and, we have ways around that, but it is something that people will bump into. You might go and see a lawyer to say you want to incorporate as a worker cooperative, and the answer might be, well, what is that? Or like, why would you do that? Or something
Right.
like this. And There can also be a challenge with finding worker co-op friendly capital that understands the model as well, like what we call the equity gap between what the members would invest and what conventional lenders would put in. And we do have a small fund to help with this, but it's not enough. And so that is something that people run into as well. I mean, I guess the other issue is this for all small business, all small enterprise these days is it's a challenging time to run a business, especially in certain sectors. And then, of course, we have like all kinds of uncertainty in coming weeks with what's going on in the US. And that is going to have some impact on some of the worker co-ops as well, I would imagine.
And it's interesting that you mentioned as you're thinking about starting a co-op or transitioning or converting to one, when you go to the would-be experts to say, okay, this is what I'm thinking, you're going there hoping that they're going to guide you. But it's almost like if they don't know what you're talking about, you have to then explain and get like guide them into it. So I'm curious if we can backtrack just a little. Give us a genesis of you getting into worker co-ops. What was the initial thing that brought you into the space?
Well, I was quite interested in employee ownership as a concept. And in my 20s, I went to law school trying to figure out what did I want to do really for work. And I did an independent research paper on employee laws around employee ownership and discovered the worker co-op model. And I just felt like, well, bingo, that's what I was looking for. And it just so happened that at the time toward the time I was finishing law school, the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation was forming, and went to their initial conference. And then when they had a struggle getting incorporated, they contacted me about a year later and contacted me to help them get incorporated. And I've been involved, initially very part-time, but full-time for a long time. So.
Oh, nice. And so before I ask you kind of where, like, let's say 5 years from now, you feel like this space is going, up to this point, and you mentioned I guess, the legislation around the employee cooperatives, and you're riding the coattails of that. So what does that legislation really mean on the grand scale of things? And then how do you feel it'll help the worker co-op
Mhm.
segment?
So what's in place right now, and I think this has been discussed in other sessions as well, um, when a business owner sells to or transfers to an employee ownership trust, and they've had a capital gain on their business, they get an exemption of up to $10 million for making that sale. So it's an incentive for the owner to sell to employees in that form. And what the draft legislation, so that legislation is in place for employee ownership trust. And what the draft legislation says for worker co-ops is basically the same thing if it's being sold or transitioned to a worker co-op. Um, and I mean, the way that is going to help, we've all been talking for years about the silver tsunami and the impending, mass retirements, including of business owners, which we can see happening now. And so I think, especially in rural areas, but not only, as there's not enough buyers for those businesses, externally, it's going to be helpful to transfer to employees. And this legislation gives an incentive to the seller, the former business owner, to sell their transfer to employees. Um, did you have another part of that question, or is that the
No,
main?
yeah, just being able to
Yeah.
get the context of what that legislation meant. And so now that it's in place, where do you feel like the landscape will change over the next 5 years, being able to use that momentum?
Well, we're still waiting to get it technically in place for worker co-ops, and hopefully it's a non-issue and it's a technicality. But um, I mean, we're already seeing more interest in the worker co-op model because one of the things that happens is when income tax legislation changes, the accountants out there, as they get their professional, you know, annual training and so on, they hear about it, right? So then there's more chance that more people will be hearing about it. So we expect more conversions. Um, but we also expect more kind of like demand on the services we're providing because at the moment we have no government support at all. We're basically running on our own steam to provide the services that we provide, um, with various programs that generate some revenue. But what we need to see is there being more capacity to provide grants to enable folks who can accompany people to do these transitions into worker co-ops. We typically call them worker co-op developers, and more capital as well in our fund so that we can invest in the newly formed worker co-ops.
Excellent. And I'm curious what your call to action would be, I guess, beyond just the government getting this passed through, like to other investors or other funds, even to academics and other nonprofits about this space. What would be that call to action?
So in terms of generally, I would say, one thing we are going to be embarking on shortly is to organize to do a community bond raise for the Tenacity Works Fund, which is the name of our investment fund, with Tapestry. And once we've got that underway, we also plan to approach the existing social finance funds or wholesalers to match that funding as well. So people can watch for that through our website and newsletters and think about investing. Another thing that people can do, we have a campaign that we've organized, which we call The Future is Worker Owned. I'm going to drop this link in the chat because I happen to have it here. And they can sign on and support what we're advocating for with government.
And that one's the future is worker owned.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. And then I did have a conversation piece around the difference between co-ops across Canada versus co-ops in Quebec.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Quebec, unlike outside Quebec, for Canada, we see a very robust ecosystem in place with great supports for development. And so with a bit less than 25% of the population, Quebec has over 2/3 of the worker co-ops in the country,
Whoa.
which is amazing and wonderful. And they've actually got three different worker co-op federations in Quebec. There's the Federation of Forestry Co-ops of Quebec, the Federation of Paramedic Co-ops of Quebec. So those two sectors have a high concentration of worker co-ops. And then Le Réseau Co-op, which is like the co-op network, which is similar to us, which is all sectors together. And all three of them are region federation members of our organization. But, they are really lucky in that the government is willing to put resources for capital and for technical assistance, into the organizations that can provide it. And I mean, that goes for the entire co-op sector. The entire co-op sector in Quebec is larger per capita than it is, outside. And part of it is that. And part of it is, I think, it's a way to protect the minority language right in this sort of sea of English, because the more you can do cooperatively, sort of the easier it is to ensure you keep your language while you're working and while you're participating in the economy. But so how is it different? I mean, we collaborate together. I think depends on the region and everything. Perhaps to some degree, the co-ops outside Quebec are very, very much values focused. I think many in Quebec are as well, but like I think it's such a bigger part of the economy in Quebec. It's like it's a bigger variety of people that you'll find, whereas you find very much values-driven people often engaged outside of Quebec.
Okay. I guess because it's more commonplace there, people see it as an option. But here, it's really people have to go look for it. Like when your values based, like, oh, this is the best option to match my values, like that kind of
Mm,
stuff.
more commonly, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know CWCF has facilitated some brilliant work around reconciliation, equity, diversity, inclusion. I was curious how that process has helped to change your work.
Hmm. Well, we have, I think, especially since the Floyd murder in 2020, we've really focused on this. We've launched this JEDDI committee. We have made statements around acknowledging that acknowledgements aren't enough, and so therefore we're putting out resources by way of racial justice grants and bursaries for racialized people to study co-op development or co-op management, um, and are really seeking to partner more with folks who are working in this space and are really being inspired by them. I mean, it was mentioned that Juliet Kego Omeonido, who's one of our BIPOC advisors to our
Yes.
board, has been very active in this space in prior years. And yeah, just wonderful to connect that way. I mean, I think we feel committed to all of us of every race and gender and
Mhm.
ability are committed to making this movement accessible and open to everyone. And so we're just focusing there. And this is the reason we're partnering around that research project as well, so that we can understand better what are the specific challenges so that we can attempt to meet them. And we're very pleased that the funding from SSHRC just came through for this research. So we'll be working with equity denied group led worker co-ops over the coming months on that. And it'll be featured at our conference in November in Edmonton as well.
Excellent. And with ACBN, us being able to manage our own small microloan program, I'm curious how it's been developing your fund. And then how do you navigate the investment committee and navigating keeping the co-op principles as you're building your fund?
Well, let's see. We have a phenomenal investment committee with 5 people on it. We're actually looking for a member on it at the moment because one of them, Bernard Ondour, became the CEO of Cap Finance in Quebec, and so had to resign from all his investment committees. But anyway, we have a fairly tight grid that we use to analyze the loans, and yeah, so we follow this, and I mean the fund was obtained through as a federal pilot project, and I think we've basically learned by attempting whatever we attempted, like what to do and what not to do. And certainly it's really focused on trying to support the co-ops. And one thing I love is once we've placed a loan in a co-op, then we are staying in much closer touch with them. So when we see that they're struggling, we can then help them out, right? And that's a really good thing to be able to do.
Oh, I love that. And
We
even
have not yet focused, by the way, on
hmm,
raising new capital outside of talking to government. So this will be a new path for us to be doing the capital raise through community bonds, and we're excited about embarking on that in the near future. So
yeah, and we'd love to keep in touch or keep following along with that journey. Is there a timeline? Is it this year that you're hoping to launch? Is it the bond that you're doing, that campaign?
it's the community bond campaign we're going to do, and our goal is to be like fully launched in about 8 months, and then be ready ahead of next year's RRSP season.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, excellent.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll definitely be following along with that. And you did mention earlier that you started your career as a lawyer. And so now, as the leader of CWCF, I'm curious, over the past couple decades, you've seen a lot of things that you want to be in place that don't exist. So if you did have a magic wand, what regulations would you want to see changed?
I would personally love to see this component of an indivisible reserve or an asset lock in worker cooperatives be present, because what we really see is that in the parts of the world, including Quebec, including France, Argentina, Spain, where there are a lot of worker cooperatives, there tends to be this. And basically, it means that the surpluses that are made over time are viewed as more collective wealth. And it doesn't mean you can't share some surplus with workers, but it means that um, that collective wealth belongs to the co-op movement and not to just that individual co-op. And once you have that in place, it tends to make it easier for governments to want to support the model, because it's not just private business, right? So if we had that, it would be super helpful. And I mean, I feel that it's pretty clear that the kind of 5 things that are needed in an ecosystem to have a robust, growing worker co-op movement are um, good co-op legislation, some way to promote and educate about the movement, technical assistance to develop, uh, friendly capital, and aftercare. And one thing that has changed over time is the legislation in Canada for worker co-ops has gotten quite a bit better in the 25 or 27 years I've been deeply involved. But the other pieces have not significantly changed. I mean, I think our organization is in a stronger position to provide some of all of those things. It just tends to be too little just for lack of resources to be able to do more. So if, you know, if we could see anything change, it would be more resources to support more of that kind of work, and in partnership with other organizations that are also working in a similar space.
Excellent. And I'm so curious, what drives you? Like, what keeps you going in this space? Because you're seeing a lot of change, but it took decades to get here. So, what kept you in? I was like, kept you in the game to say, like, even though there wasn't legislation before that we can look to, that the government is actually paying attention. Did you always feel like it would get there, or is this just something that needs to be done? So I'm sticking with it.
Well, I think whether or not we have outside support, we've been able to figure out like how to uh, resource the work we're doing, or find sponsors for it such that we can accomplish, what we're trying to do at a certain level. It often feels like not enough. I mean, but really, I think I guess my really strong belief that this is the best way to organize an economy where there is this kind of democracy and flattening of wages and all of that. And um, I mean, having had the privilege of going to Mondragon, Spain, where it's very much a worker co-op led economy, like it's the levels of trust and the quality of life are so high. And um, I guess I just feel this with virtually all of the worker co-ops that I interact with. I mean, it's hard when one is struggling. It's hard when any business is struggling, but I think outside of those times, like it's the best way to work. And we've seen lots of examples where someone decides for whatever reason they're going to leave their worker co-op, and not too much long later, they're back around trying to find a different one to work in because it's kind of hard to go back to a very hierarchical capitalist space when you've had the opportunity to work in a worker co-op context. So.
And like having your voice heard and not feeling like you only have to, like, what is that, I guess, top down bureaucracy. But I do know we had Matthew Mendelson on from Social Capital Partners earlier on the panel. And so now that $10 million capital gains that you're talking about, when you hear it announced, you don't really know what went into getting it done. So I'm curious if you could share some insight on that process and then how you have to do that process again to make sure the worker co-op legislation gets through.
Mhm. I think that the social capital partners and is it called the Employee Ownership Canada? No, Coalition of Employee Ownership of Canada. They did a phenomenal job over quite a number of years with a lot of high profile people involved to sensitize the government around the issue. And it was a very big effort. And we stayed in touch with them and we, talked to finance department as well. And I think we were able to use the argument of it should be a level playing field for all types of employee ownership. And they pretty quickly agreed. And then they were very amenable to working with us on the details of the legislation to make sure the technicalities were all correct. And so it was actually a very collaborative, good process all around. And I think without that groundwork that was laid over a lot of time by um, Matthew Mendelson and John Schell and so on, we would have not been able to, get the agreement to go forward. And it's just a little waiting game now until Parliament's functioning, and then we'll be there as well. The other piece we have to deal with is the fact that this was announced as a 3-year program starting last January 1st. So like if it comes into place like this summer or early fall, then it's really half. So we are going to also be working on extending the time. And I imagine the EOT folks may be thinking the same.
Nice. And sorry to double back. I did have a question in the chat from Rachel about if you can explain the difference between worker cooperatives and worker shareholder cooperatives.
Sure. So workers' shareholder cooperatives are basically, at this point, they're just in Quebec. And what they are is a cooperative made up of workers in a business corporation, and that worker cooperative owns a percentage of the shares in that. So it's got more in common with like an employee stock ownership plan in many ways. It could be anywhere from a tiny percentage of the shares in the business corporation to upwards of 100, right? So it's tended to be used in Quebec as a financing mechanism for business corporations that want employee buy-in, but there doesn't tend to be very much participation in the governance of the business. So it's more a financing mechanism, I guess. Coopérative de travailleurs actionnaires is what's called in French. And there was one once in Ontario, but it it doesn't exist anymore. And to my knowledge, there aren't any outside of Quebec, but they're an interesting financing model for sure.
Gotcha. And we did have a question from Chloe. Considering the need for legislative change, are the cooperatives going to formally endorse any candidates in the upcoming Ontario and or federal elections?
Cooperatives are apolitical. And so, although we may get along better with certain politicians than others or what have you, we don't endorse candidates. We do tend to try to ask every party to put co-op friendly things in their platforms and approach all parties. But no, we don't do any endorsing.
Okay,
So.
so I'm curious. Her second part to the question, or the second part was the Co-op Party of the UK took direct action and won seats. So I'm curious, how will co-ops educate their members so that they can mobilize their labor power into tangible political change?
Yeah, the co-op party in the UK is really interesting and is either part of or very linked to the Labour Party. And I understand they've made a commitment to try to double the number of co-ops in the UK in this mandate, which is phenomenal. Um, so, I mean, I think we just want to encourage our co-op members and everyone who's interested to work with it, whoever they relate to politically, to try to encourage getting it into their platforms as well, and to actually take action once they're in a position to do so.
Makes sense. And I was curious, are there any other co-op leaders in Canada or initiatives that you'd like to amplify or that are inspiring you right now?
I mean, there are lots of other co-op leaders in Canada, and there are a lot of other co-op organizations. There's the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada, which has been doing phenomenal work in housing strategy and getting traction there. Again, needs to be dramatically more because of the state of housing in the country. And then there's the credit union. What is it called? The Canadian Credit Union Association, which brings in all the credit unions across the country, and they do lots of advocacy. A lot of the large freestanding co-ops, Desjardins, cooperators, et cetera, do their own advocacy as well. And then, of course, there's Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, which is the apex, like umbrella organization for all types of co-ops, Anglophone and Francophone across the country, and they're doing phenomenal work in advocacy in all areas and supporting the work that we're doing as well. Yeah. So, and what is inspiring to us? I mean, I think the work that CMC is doing and sorry, Co-ops and Mutuals Canada and the Co-op Housing Federation are both very inspiring. And we're basically collaborating very, very closely as well.
Love that. And I was curious, what or how do you define success? So now you're in this work. What does success look like for you based on, this effort that we're putting into changing legislation and really making this more well known? And or what
Mm.
would be an ultimate goal for you?
I mean, I think we want to see what we call a solidarity economy that we have created along with partners who share these similar goals, really an economy that's based on the needs of people and planet. Um, an economy where there are many more worker co-ops than there currently are. So there's more democracy and shared prosperity, and that it be very much reflective uh, of the population so that we have, all kinds of people intricately involved in the leadership, and that people who wish to start a worker co-op or to convert an existing business to one have all the supports they need to do it. Um,
Mhm.
yeah. And it'd be like based on JEDDI, right? Justice, equity, diversity, decolonization, and inclusion.
Exactly. And you mentioned kind of the landscape changing with our relationship with the US, but we do know that you've done some great work with Dr. Jessica Gordon Nemhart in the past. So, what is the relationship between Canadian co op ecosystems and the United States? And will there be any shift with now the new administration coming in?
Well, I will just say, as a general principle, one of the ways that the sort of background, one of the ways that cooperatives live the co-op principles is cooperation among cooperatives. And one way to do that is creating associations that kind of like go up in a way, right? It's very bottom up. So worker co-ops come together to form the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation along with the Quebec federations too. And then we collaborate in the continent with the US Federation and when it has functioned with the Mexican Confederation. The international organization is a French acronym called CICOPA. So that's sort of the International Worker Confederation. So we are in the CICOPA-North America. We collaborate together there. And then there's also Americas region, and then the world level. So we are planning, along with the U.S. Federation, to have a special day dedicated to the International Year of Co-ops at our conference in November. We participate in quarterly meetings. We run into each other at conferences. So I think it's not clear to me yet how this might shift with what is going on in the US. I know that there are a lot of worker co-ops in the US that include undocumented migrants, and there's a lot of concern, obviously. And so we have a meeting in a week, and so I'm looking forward to finding out, what more will shift there. But I mean, I think we are inspired by what they do very much. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're going to be doing as well, or starting off, is a Black Co-op caucus, and that is encouraged in part by what we've seen happening in the U.S. because their federation does have similar kinds of caucuses, and we would like to create more, but it depends on if there's folk who are willing to take up the mantle and create other caucuses. But that one for sure is getting started, and it's not only for worker co-ops. In conjunction with Co-ops in Mutual Canada, it's going to be general for all types.
Gotcha. Excellent. And as always, really want to thank you, Hazel, for your consistent leadership and for taking the time to be with me on this virtual fireside chat here at the Social Impact Conference. And now also I wanted to say personally, thank you for the support with, as I've been looking at transitioning to a cooperative, your information, your website, and your team has been helpful. And now us encouraging other entrepreneurs to also shift to a cooperative. I'm curious, any closing thoughts for the audience or calls to actions for those that are here and maybe budding entrepreneurs that might shift to a cooperative instead of the standard status quo?
Let's see, closing words for me. I mean, I will hope you will get engaged with our organization, sign up for our e-newsletter, get in touch with us if you're interested in joining any, like the JEDDI committee or the Black Co-op caucus or anything. Come to our free webinars about how to do it. The one called What is a Worker Co-op? Juliet Tago is now leading, so I would encourage folks to check that out especially. We're doing coming out shortly with an advanced finance webinar series for worker co-ops. So yeah, just get engaged and hang out, and you keep up your great work too.
I really appreciate that. And again, thank you for you to being here, and for those that are here present. There's always so much that we could be doing with our days, so taking time to be here at the conference is really appreciated and not lost on us. And as always, we close our sessions by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all of those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together to build our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you to those that have joined us. We'll see you at the next session of the Social Impact Conference. Have a great afternoon. See you soon.